How's it going, everyone? Mountainspyder here, bringing another episode in the Pokemon TCG series. So today, I'm going to be taking a look at the top 10 theme decks to use in Pokemon Trading Card Game Online in June 2020. Now, I'm really looking at the theme decks and which decks I think perform best. Now, this is based on my personal experience as the decks for me using them, as well as me playing against these decks. Alongside this is some feedback I've gotten from my Discord community and there are comments on Facebook as well. So, without further ado, let's jump into these decks. So, the first decks I'm going to be looking at is the Zation and Zamazenta. For me, these two theme decks come in the 10th spot. Now, I grouped them together because I find that they are very similar power levels. To me, there's not a lot of a difference between playing the Zation and the Zamazenta deck. They are essentially two sides of the same coin. It is a bit unfortunate that they're both metal decks with the two newest theme decks to come out, because it gets pretty stale. Now, that being said, these decks are certainly fun to play. And I've put them on the 10th spot because they are reliable. They do what they're supposed to do, which is be average theme decks. Like, they're alright. They're not fantastic, but they're alright. And they work. So yeah, looking at these two decks, the pros, they've got few filler Pokemon. Now, what I mean with that is that with a lot of theme decks, specifically the older ones, you've got a lot of filler Pokemon that are really just there because you don't really want to use them that much. Whereas with these two decks, pretty much everything can be used and has its place in its deck. So the deck synergizes much better with itself because you're not wanting to throw away Pokemon. You're decently happy with whatever you get, which is really good, and it's a step in the right direction for the theme decks. I am certainly happier with this direction rather than having filler Pokemon that are there to just build your collection, but you're never going to use them. As I said before, these decks are reliable. They get the job done. They don't do a fantastic job at it, but they get it done. And as I said earlier, the deck synergizes really well with itself. When you're looking at the Zamazenta deck, you've got, for instance, like the Ferrothorn, which is able to shift the energies around onto other Pokemon, which conserves your energy. And you've got other Pokemon that work really well with each other. And the Zation deck, you've got the Pidove line, which is an accelerated growth and a way to essentially dig those cards out. So the deck works well with itself. And it plays cleanly. It draws well. It works well. In all honesty, the only cards that don't really synergize with these decks are the two mascots, being Zation and Zamazenta. Again, I apologize if I'm butchering those names. They're strange. Also, I am terrible with Pokemon names. So yes, in all honesty, the mascots are the cards that fit in worst with this deck, which is really disappointing. Obviously, I didn't expect them to put in the VMAX or the really special editions of these cards. But the fact that these legendaries clock in at 120 HP with very average attacks is disappointing. There's much better Pokemon that come from the other ones, the other theme decks. So, moving on to the cons. What makes these decks bad? Well, their typing. Metal typing is terrible in the current meta. The reason for that is there's a lot of fire type decks that are in the meta. It is what it is, and that makes metal that much worse. On top of that, there's quite a few steel type decks in the meta, which then resists the steel attacks, which makes it that much harder. The one thing the deck has going forward is that it resists grass. So the one good matchup, as I've stated here, is Rillaboom. It's one of the few times these decks really do shine is against the Rillaboom deck, because they resist it. Other than that, you do relatively well against Tropical Takedown as well, because of the way the deck plays, and again, because you're preventing that damage from the Alolan Executor, which is one of the primary heavy hitters in that deck. Other than those two decks, the Zation and Zamazenta deck are they do average against most decks. As I said, they're very much your middle of the line decks. Not great, not bad. They're just kind of there, which is a bit sad coming from the new range, but it is what it is. Bad matchups. Every single fire deck. You do not want to go up against a fire deck with these two decks. Most of your cards will get knocked up by a 60 damage attack, which is not fun, and all of the other fire type decks can do that. So you don't want to be seeing any fire type decks because of the glaring weakness. Unseen Depths, it's a very powerful deck and it's able to hit the bench as well, which can sometimes really disrupt you, especially on the Zation side when you're building into Pdav, or on the Zamazenta side when you essentially like switch your energies over to your bench Pokemon. With the Unseen Depths, you can still then hit the bench, which you can hit the Pokemon that you just swap the energies to, which then leaves you in a very awkward position with your Ferrothorn sitting in the primary spot and having no energies on it. Other than that, Towering Heights, it tends to stomp this deck pretty easily, and Stormcaller, it resists it. So there's a lot of bad matchups for these decks, and unfortunately a lot of the bad matchups are played very often in the meta. So again, I like these decks. I think they're decent theme decks that are fun to play, just not very good to play. Alright, moving on to our next one. In our number 9 spot this month, taking a look at the Rillaboom deck. Now, Rillaboom deck has a very special place in my heart, and it breaks my heart considering how badly the deck does in the meta. That being said, there's a lot going for this deck. Arguably, this Rillaboom deck has the best energy acceleration in the theme format. With the way Eldegoss works, that you're able to just take 3 energies out of your deck and attach them to your Pokemon is absolutely fantastic. It's what makes this deck good. Honestly, the MVP for this deck is Eldegoss because of that one ability. And Eldegoss plays really nicely into our second point, which is the good normal mons. You've got Snorlax in this deck. Snorlax, for 3 energies, does 80 damage, or 4 energies for 130, with 150 HP. So it's a super heavy hitting normal mon, which means you've got good coverage against most of the decks out there. And like with that Snorlax, you've got some really good heavy hitters in this deck. Rillaboom clocks in the 190 HP and deals 180 damage with a secondary attack with 4 energies. His primary attack is 3 energies for 90 damage and 10 damage across the opponent's bench. So this deck hits really hard. And on top of that, you got Maractus, which with just 2 energies can deal up to 120 damage. Now, the trick is it's a coin flip, so you got to be really, really careful when it comes to using it. This deck has really good aggro potential. What I mean by that is being able to play really aggressively. And again, what plays into that is the Eldegoss. You're able to get 3 turns ahead of your opponent with energy acceleration, which allows you to be super aggressive with your Pokemon. You can quite easily have a turn 3 Snorlax hitting 430 damage, which is really, really good. But now, moving on to the biggest drawback for this deck. It's typing. As I said earlier with the 2 metal type decks, Fire is the most prominent typing in the theme format. This deck does really badly against the Fire type Pokemon. And because of that, whilst I think that this is a good deck, I really do think this is a well-constructed good deck, the typings in the current meta make it incredibly difficult to get consistent wins with it. And the second thing that makes getting wins, especially consistent wins, is this deck is a bit luck-based. Because you need to pull your Eldegoss, and if you're focusing on Maractus, you're basically banking on coin flips. So because of that, you've got to be very, very careful when playing this deck. And especially with Maractus, who can really be an MVP for this deck, it's very luck-based. Now, that being said, this deck does have some pretty good matchups. In the sense of Unseen Depths, because you're able to play really quickly, and you are playing into your opponent's weakness, you tend to do relatively well with this deck against it. Stormcaller, same thing. If you're able to play quickly and essentially beat Stormcaller's aggro you'll be in a really, really good spot with this deck. Because, like your Snorlax, if you're able to get your Snorlax online early, you'll be able to knock out all of your opponent's mons except for Dragonite, which is huge. So you can just start steamrolling your opponent. Another deck this does really well against is Intellion. Intellion is one of the other Sword and Shield decks that came out, and this deck performs relatively well against it. Even though Intellion isn't weak against this deck, you would tend to do better with the Rillaboom deck because of the energy acceleration. That's really the cornerstone of this deck, is the energy acceleration. Now, take a look at the bad matchups. Again, all fire decks. You do not want to be seeing a fire deck when playing Rillaboom. It's not going to end well for you. Now, there is one slight catch to that, is the fact that you have Snorlax. As I said earlier, Snorlax being normal mon, you're able to essentially negate that fire weakness. If you're going up against a fire type deck, you've only got 2 Snorlaxes, so you got to make them count. If you can make those Snorlaxes count, you will actually do relatively well against a fire type deck. But you have to get the Snorlaxes out, and you've got to protect those Snorlaxes. One other thing I forgot to mention earlier, one of the pros of this deck, it actually has really good heal, in the sense that it runs 2 potions as well as a Pokemon Center Lady. So you end up being quite resilient with this deck, which is also really good. This deck does suffer slightly against Soaring Storm, because you don't want to be taking damage on your bench. And sorry, I got mixed up earlier between Stormcaller and Soaring Storm. Sorry, Soaring Storm's a bad matchup, because unless you can out-aggro the deck, you're going to be in a really bad spot. And Soaring Storm does put damage on your bench. Now, the reason I say this deck worked well against Stormcaller was because you can play very quickly against Stormcaller. Stormcaller tends to play on the slower side because you're building up into a stage 2 with Ampharos. And the deck doesn't really come online before that. So, good matchup, Stormcaller. Sorry about the switch there. And then bad matchup was Soaring Storm. Whilst, yes, you can knock out most of your opponent's deck if you can get your Snorlax online, the issue is that if you're not able to out-aggro your opponent, you'll most likely lose against Soaring Storm because of the consistent damage Soaring Storm provides. So, moving on over to part 8 is actually Intellion. Now, I'm not a big fan of the Intellion deck. I know there's quite a few players out there that are enjoying this deck and playing well with it. Now, basically the main selling point for this deck is its typing. Its typing helps it out so much because there's so many fire type decks. Another thing that really helps this deck is that you're able to restrict energies with the Intellion. 2 energies, 100 damage, and you can bounce an energy back to your opponent's hand. This is going to really shut down the higher energy cost decks, and you can have a lot of fun with this as well. Intellion is a really awesome card, and if you're able to get it online relatively early, you can shut down your opponent quite well with the deck as well, because you run the Snipe ability, which you deal 40 damage and you discard one of your opponent's cards from their hand at random. You can, if you get lucky, shut down your opponent. So overall, it works quite well. Now, the deck does have energy fetch in terms of Mantine being able to fetch you 3 energies. The problem is those energies go to your hand, and there's no way to accelerate it. So whilst you can fetch energies, you can't accelerate your energies, which is very awkward. But thankfully, the deck does have a relatively low energy cost. Most of your models only need 2 energy, with the exception of Dreadnought, who can require 3 to 4. So across the board, the deck does run at a relatively low energy cost, which really does help it out a lot. However, one of the biggest issues I find with this deck is I find it very unreliable. Again, you're kind of fishing for that Intellion, and because there's no energy acceleration, if you fall behind, it can be very difficult to catch up again. This deck doesn't do well playing from behind. Again, biggest con, no energy acceleration. And after that, this deck has very average damage. Is a lot of like the 90, 100, 130 range. There's no big heavy hitters. You're not going to be hitting over 150 or 180 reliably. So you really need to be playing ahead of your opponent with this deck, which can be challenging. Now, there are some good matchups. Both Blazing Volcano and Cinderace, you'll do relatively well against those decks because of their typing. Because you're a water type deck, and you'll tend to do more damage than they can deal with. And on top of that, this deck plays relatively well against the steel type decks. It tends to draw out what it needs against them, and is able to counter what they're doing relatively easily. So in terms of performance, I generally perform very well against those two decks with the Intellion deck. Now, there's a lot of bad matchups. Laser Focus, Soaring Storm, Unseen Depths, Torrential Cannon, and Relentless Flame. Now, a lot of these cases are because this deck tends to play a little bit slower, and this deck tends to not like playing from behind. All of those decks tend to be able to play quite quickly, as well as having a chance to hit the bench, which again, this deck doesn't like when that happens to it. Ironically, Relentless Flame does quite well against this deck because of Nidoqueen. Nidoqueen KOs everything in the deck, and so does Charizard, which makes it very difficult. And the fact that Charizard doesn't require energy buildup makes it very difficult to actually slow it down. So ironically, Relentless Flame actually does really well against the Intellion deck, unless you're able to get an Intellion out early for the 100 damage. But again, your opponent can just switch in the Charizard and it'll be able to deal with you. So, going over to our next one, in our spot 7, we actually got Laser Focus. Now, this is a bit on the older side in terms of the decks on this list, but it performs super, super well. One of the big reasons for this is Malamar. This deck has a fantastic energy recycling system, in the fact that you're able to take energies from your discard pile and attach them to your bench. Now, this works really well in the fact that this deck switches very well because it runs the surfboard, which reduces the cost of your switching by 1. So this enables you to essentially switch out your Pokemon, load up energies, and be good to go on the next turn. Other than that, the deck does actually have some pretty decent fetch. You're able to get out your Necrozma and your Malamar pretty reliable with Mysterious Treasure. On top of that, this deck plays super aggressively. Because you've got such a fantastic energy recycling system, you're generally ahead of your opponent in terms of energies, because you can retreat without really worrying about losing those energies. So because of that, you're constantly playing ahead of your opponent, which enables you to be really, really aggressive. Necrozma can reliably hit for about 160 damage on turn 3 if you're able to draw a Weakness Guard energy. On the cons, Weakness Guard energy. There's only 2 in the deck, and you need it. You cannot have that card discarded, and you do not ever want to see Weakness Guard as a prize card. You need to get that card out, and you need to get it out really quickly. Without it, Necrozma only deals 100 damage. With it, it's 160. If you can get that out early on Necrozma, you can probably sweep your opponent without that much difficulty. So make sure you don't lose that special energy. Good matchups. I said it's decent against most decks, and the reason I said that is that if you're able to get the right draws, this deck handles every other deck out there relatively well. The fact that it's a psychic type deck means that you're rarely playing against your weakness, and if you do, you're strong against your opponent either way. This deck does run a lot of normal type Pokemon, so Towering Heights, as I said, can be a bit of a problem because of that weakness. Other than that, Stormcaller, Soaring Storm, you don't like playing against those decks because those decks are able to hit your bench. As I said, because you're doing a lot of switching, and because you've got such great support with Malamar, you don't want to lose that support. Another deck that could actually be added to those bad matchups is Unseen Depths. Intellion is going to hit your Malamars, and that was a huge shutdown problem for this deck. So be aware that you need to protect your bench as much as possible with this deck. But if you're able to, and if you're able to play quickly, this deck will perform very well with you. This, I must say, is a deck that I'm slightly biased towards because I really do enjoy playing this deck, and I've tended to have really good success with this deck. So, going on to the next one, taking a look at Stormcaller. Now, Stormcaller is definitely a fan favorite. I see a lot of people shouting out on both my Discord and on YouTube. It's got a lot going for it. It's got great shutdown in the sense that every second Pokemon basically paralyzes, and you can really consistently paralyze or confuse your opponent, and it is super, super frustrating to play against it. The deck does have decent draw, especially in terms of Blitzel, which is able to discard your hand and draw 4 new cards. So you're able to go through your deck relatively quickly with this deck. Ampharos, again, 150 HP, so pretty tanky. It's able to hit your opponent's bench. Now, granted, it's only 50 damage, but the fact that you can essentially paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon and then be hitting their bench for 50, 2 of their Pokemon for 50 every single turn, it really adds up. Across the board, this deck has a relatively low energy cost for your Pokemon's attacks. you're only really equipping 2 energies to most of your Pokemon, which is fantastic, and it's what you want to see. And definitely, hands down, this is the status effect deck in theme. If you enjoy playing with status effects, I would definitely go for this deck. Now, the cons. Ironically, this deck is super energy reliant, and that's because of Amphross's Pokemon ability, which enables you to discard 2 energies from your hand into the lost zone, and then to paralyze your opponent's active Pokemon. This is a fantastic ability, and it really is what makes this deck. But you're losing 2 energies every time you do it, and there's no way to get those energies back. So you've got to be really, really careful with it, and you want to constantly have 2 energies in your hand for that exact same reason. Now, this deck does rely on getting Ampharos out, because Raikou does nothing without Ampharos. So you need to get that stage 2 Ampharos out. And because of that, the deck tends to play quite a bit slower, because you're building into that stage 2. Now, if you're lucky, and you're able to get the stage 2 out on turn 3, then you're in a really good spot. But if you're not, the deck does tend to play slower, which can be a problem against the more aggressive decks. Now, in terms of good matchups, you do relatively well against Intellion, because the Intellion deck is weak against this entire deck, essentially, which is really good. And you're able to make really good use out of it as well. Soaring Storm, again, you are strong against Thunderous, which helps a lot. Strong against Tornadus, which helps a lot. And being able to hit the bench is fantastic because Soaring Storm hits its own bench. So the fact that you can then finish off those Pokemon, you can snipe some prize cards, which is always a really good thing. And on top of that, you do well against the Steel type decks because you resist their damage, which makes it that much more difficult to play with those 2 new Steel type decks. Now, there are some bad matchups. Towering Heights hurts this deck a lot because Towering Heights is effective against it, and because Towering Heights likes having damage on its bench. And if Towering Heights doesn't want damage on its bench, it can play a Mew, and then Ampharos can only hit the active Pokemon, which is a huge problem. Towering Heights does also run a lot of switches, which makes it difficult to play against it. Blazing Volcano, Relentless Flame, those 2 decks tend to play quickly against it, and they like playing aggressively, which can really, really shut down the Stormcaller deck. Now, ironically, these 10 to 6 spots were a lot more difficult to lay out than my 1 to 5. So I'd like to take this point to really ask you to let me know what you think about how I've structured this, especially my 10 to 6. I feel a lot more confident about 1 to 5. However, my 6 to 10, I feel like there's a lot of movement to change around these decks. So do let me know how you feel. But so, certainly, do let me know what you think between my 1 to 5s. So, spot 5. Definitely a biased favorite deck for me, I'll happily admit it, is Blazing Volcano. This is a deck I've got a really, really great success rate with. It plays super reliably because you're able to fix your draws. And on top of that, you're able to fetch cards as well. Now, this is huge in theme because there's not many decks that are able to do it as reliably as Blazing Volcano can. This deck also plays super quickly. If you prioritize Houndoom and prioritize outdrawing your opponent, you're dishing out 130 damage from turn 2 for just 2 energies. It is fantastic. And there are very few decks that can outpace Blazing Volcano when it's on a good draw streak. On top of that, this deck does have energy acceleration in the form of Shuckle, which is able to put energies back onto your Pokemon. Energy acceleration and energy recycling is always a good thing for a theme deck, because there's so few theme decks that can do it well, and Blazing Volcano does it very well. It does also have an ability to hit the bench with the form of Blaziken. However, Blaziken does tend to be a bit more of a supporter card than an active Pokemon. That being said, Blaziken in the active spot, you can rack up damage super quickly on your opponent's Pokemon. Now, there are some bad things for this deck. You need to outdraw your opponent. If you're building into Houndoom, you need to keep a very close eye on how many cards your opponent has. And you need to keep a very good eye on how many cards you're playing every turn. If you catch yourself out and you accidentally play too many cards, you can put yourself in a terrible position. So be very careful. Because of that, this deck does rely on controlling the pace of the game. You want to be outspeeding your opponent. The name Blazing Volcano suits this deck perfectly well because you want to be playing fast. You do not want to be playing the long game with this deck. This deck does slightly rely on combos. You want to get the Shuckle out to charge yourself up. And especially you want to get Mokago out to make Entei really hit home. Entei only deals about 80 damage unless you get lucky with the top decks on either side being energy. So you want to get those Mokagos out. In terms of good matchups, you go against Rillaboom because of the typing. Steel type decks because of the typing. And funny enough, Relentless Flame. Relentless Flame tends to play with a smaller hand size because they're constantly evolving their Pokemon or constantly building their bench. Relentless Flame wants to have Pokemon on their bench so they can evolve them quicker, which means their hands are smaller, which means it's easier to get Houndoom off. So if you're able to go against Relentless Flame and get Houndoom prioritized, you'll do really, really well. In terms of bad matchups, Soaring Storm and Unseen Depths. Unseen Depths, typing. Soaring Storm can hit your bench, which is a really big problem. And Soaring Storm is able to knock out your Pokemon with relative ease. So do be careful with it. Entei will survive the 3 energy attack from Thundurus, because Thundurus only deals 120 damage. But again, if you've already got damage on you from something else, you're in a really bad spot. Overall though, very happy with this deck because it plays reliably, which is what I want to have from a theme deck. Going on to our next one, in spot 4, Towering Heights. Again, fan favorite, and it deserves to be one. This deck is awesome. It plays so well, so aggressively, and it just works. It's a super well constructed deck with very few filler Pokemon. So in terms of this deck, the fact that it's a fighting type deck, and it's basically the main fighting type deck you come against, means you're able to knock out your opponent's normal type Pokemon relatively easily. This deck does also have the bonus of being a deck that energy accelerates very well from Drought from Groudon. You're able to put energies from your hand onto Pokemon either in your active spot or your bench, and you're able to get those energies out with a Lady. So you've got a good chance of having energies in your hand. Also, there is draw fixing, which helps that much more. What goes hand in hand with that is it makes fantastic synergy. This deck works super well together. You're able to you're able to hit your own bench and put damage on it, which means that your Thralls are able to deal that much more damage. Thrall is definitely an MVP of this deck. Being able to get 120 damage off on turn 2 is terrifying. You're playing against Towering Heights, be very wary of hitting your opponent's active Pokemon unless you're going to knock it out. Because of that, this deck plays super aggressively. You can play really quickly with this deck if you're going into the Thrall build. This deck's got great comeback mechanics in the form of Garchomp. Garchomp deals more damage if your opponent has taken more prize cards than you. So you're able to come back pretty reliably with Garchomp. This deck is, I think, the only deck in theme that has bench protection in the form of Mew, which means that if you've got Mew down, your opponent can't damage your bench. They can put damage counters on your bench, which is something different. But they can not hit your bench, which is huge. Cons. Ironically, it requires damage on your bench. Ideally, you want to be going into the Thrall build or Palpitoad build the last stage, you want damage on your bench. So with a deck like this, you kind of want to be aware of your switching out. Don't let your Pokemon get knocked out. Rather switch them out. They'll be very, very useful later on. Because of that, this deck is weak to gusting. If you're able to knock out or pull out your opponent's Mew and shut it down and hit their bench, they're really going to feel it. This deck, because it relies on damage on your bench, if your opponent's able to finish off those Pokemon, then you're in trouble. Now, going over to the good matchups. In terms of good matchups, you do pretty well against Unseen Depths and Soaring Storm with this deck because you're able to protect your bench with Mew. As long as your Mew is up, you're in a really, really good spot with this deck. Just make sure Mew does never goes to the active spot and does not get knocked out. As long as that happens, you're in a really good spot because your bench can't get hit. Now, this deck does do pretty well against most decks out there. If you're able to play aggressively, even against the bad matchups, you will do well. Because the deck is able to play aggressively. If you're not able to get that aggressive start, these bad matchups can be a little bit difficult. Now, the bad matchups, we're looking at Rillaboom because of the typing. It's able to shut this deck down relatively easily, which can be a big problem. Soaring Storm, again, if you're not able to protect your bench, then you're in trouble with this deck. So if Soaring Storm is able to essentially get online before you get Mew down, you're in trouble. And then Relentless Flame. Relentless Flame hits hard, and that is a big problem for this deck. On top of that, if they're able to get the Nidoqueens online, they're probably going to be out damaging you, which is a really, really big problem. Now, moving over to our top 3. And our third spot, unsurprisingly, is Unseen Depths. Unseen Depths is an absolutely fantastic deck, especially in the current meta. The biggest thing it has going for it is its typing. Now, that's not saying this is a bad deck, but this deck's typing makes it that much better. Because, in my opinion, Unseen Depths is one of the best decks to shut down Relentless Flame. This deck has the best bench snipe in the current theme deck meta in the terms of Intellion. The fact that you're just dealing 100 damage to your opponent's bench is awesome, because you're probably getting a knockout every time you attack. This deck does have energy acceleration in the form of Kyogre, who's able to put energies from your discard pile back onto your Pokemon. Always, always, always a good thing. This deck does also have pretty decent draw, so you're able to get your answers out relatively easily in terms of both supporters and Pokemon. And lastly, especially with Intellion, this deck has a relatively low energy cost. Normally, you're not actually attacking with Kyogre. You're normally attacking with like Ambipom, or you're attacking with Intellion. So your energy costs are normally 1 or 2, which is really, really good. In terms of cons, you really do want to get Intellion down. Intellion is kind of the cornerstone of this deck. It's the main powerhouse, so you got to really focus on getting it out there. And the other big problem with this deck is it tends to play really slowly if you don't get Ambipom out. Ambipom turn 2 can be devastating. It's not a bad card at any stage of the game. I mean, it's 120 damage, which is always good. But early game, it can be devastating. Now, this deck's good matchups. Any fire type deck, it does really well against. And any deck that relies on bench support. So like the Malamars from Laser Focus. Because you're able to hit the bench, it does well against that. Now, Laser Focus is a bit of an awkward one, because if Laser Focus plays quickly, it's a really bad matchup for this deck. Because you're generally building into your Intellion, if you don't get the Intellion out early, Laser Focus can just run over this deck if it's able to get the Weakness Guard energy down first. So it really does come down to whoever is able to come online first. Other than that, Rillaboom does relatively well against this deck because of the typings. And Towering Heights hits hard, which is a big problem. And because Towering Heights is able to protect its bench, it seriously shuts down the damage that Intellion can do. So you don't want to be able to give your opponent time to get the Mew out. And because Towering Heights is super effective against Ambipom, it's that much more difficult to get consistent damage down. Lastly, Soaring Storm. Soaring Storm hits hard and it hits your bench, which is always a really big problem. If Soaring Storm is able to come online super quickly and play aggressively, Unseen Depths is very difficult to win with Unseen Depths against a really aggro deck unless you're able to out-aggro them with Ambipom. Now, over to the final 2. Now, this is a very interesting month because Relentless Flame, for me, has been knocked down. Now, I released a video about Relentless Flame and Soaring Storm a while back, and the more I think about it, the more I find Relentless Flame not as reliable. Now, I'll get into Soaring Storm in a second, but let's look at Relentless Flame. Now, Relentless Flame is by far the most played deck in the theme deck meta. Arguably, there's no reason against that. Super easy to play, pretty averagely reliable deck, but mainly, it's got such a great typing. It's good against so many decks out there. And it's well constructed. you've got really great fetch from both your supporters and Nidoqueens, and the deck synergizes really well. It's got two of arguably the heaviest hitters in the format, with Nidoqueen and Charizard. You're generally hitting for 130 to 200 damage with these Pokemon, so you're most likely knocking out your opponent's Pokemon. Once set up with Nidoqueen, or worse, two Nidoqueens, it is very difficult to stop. If this deck is given time, it is very difficult to beat. And this deck is very good at buying itself time with Rapidash. Agility is probably one of the most frustrating abilities in the theme format. At a coin flip, you're able to negate everything that affects Rapidash. Now, the issue with that is that there's not much gusting outside of the Intellion deck. So there's no real way to get through the setup Rapidash, other than like the Mewtwo from the old Battle Mind deck, or as I said, the Pokemon catches from Intellion. So this deck stalls very, very well. If you're able to get lucky with Rapidash, you can shut your opponent down. I've been on the receiving end of 5 agilities. It's not fun. However, this deck does require setup. You need to get Nidoqueen out, and you need to get your Charizard out. Especially your Nidoqueen. Nidoqueen is basically the main pillar that this deck is built around. You've got to protect it, and you've got to get it out there. Don't let your opponent knock out your Nidoqueen line early. Now, again, it's that heavy reliance on evolution Pokemon. Nidoqueen does nothing without a bench of evolution Pokemon. And the only real Pokemon that shine in this deck are Charizard and Nidoqueen in terms of hitting power. Rapidash is decent with 60 damage, but you're really looking for that Charizard and Nidoqueen. Now, this deck is a bit luck reliant, because you need to get Nidoqueen out, and you need to get Rapidash off. So for me, as I've said before, because this deck is very not really unreliable, but less reliable and more luck dependent, I find it lacks in that department. Now, one thing is good. It's good matchup, basically everything. You're rarely going to have an issue playing this deck. Most decks you can do really well against, especially if you can get a turn 3 Charizard. You basically won the game. Now, bad matchups, Unseen Depths and Intellion. These are for matchups. Now, Intellion is an awkward one, because Intellion needs to have good draws to do well against Relentless Flame. Because Intellion only really can slow down Nidoqueen, and it does that really well, but the problem is the Intellion deck slows down the Nidoqueen, and the Pokemon can one-shot most of the cards in Relentless Flame, other than Nidoqueen. So because of that, if your opponent's Intellion is able to have a better start than you with energies, it can be very, very difficult to come back from it. So Intellion's a bit of an awkward one, because the deck does well against Intellion, unless Relentless Flame's had a bad start, or unless Intellion's had a good start. So it's a bit of an awkward matchup, but generally Intellion's difficult to beat with Charizard, and Charizard's difficult to beat with Intellion. So it's a bit of an average matchup, because they're kind of good against each other, which is kind of weird. But the fact that the Intellion deck's able to knock out most of your Pokemon in one attack is what makes the Intellion deck good against Charizard. Now, Soaring Storm to me is a bad matchup playing Relentless Flame, because Soaring Storm is super reliable and can play really quickly. Soaring Storm also has the ability to one-hit KO all the Pokemon in this deck with Dragonite, as well as put damage on the bench, which Relentless Flame doesn't really like, because you're building up your bench. So your Pokemon tends to sit there for quite a while. So Relentless Flame, fantastic deck, always a good pickup to play. You will do well with it. But for me, this month, the number 1 spot goes to Soaring Storm. Soaring Storm is an awesome, awesome deck to play. A lot of fun to play. And overall, it's because it's a super reliable deck. Now, it's got great draws in the form of its supporters, Pidgeotto, and Grimer. Grimer's a bit of a filler Pokemon, but the fact that it doesn't require an energy and it gives you great draw works well. So don't feel bad about throwing away your Grimers after getting one attack off with them. It's what they're there for. This deck can play super aggressively if you're able to get Tornadus and Thunderous online early. You're able to deal 70 damage turn 2, 120 damage turn 3 with the Tornadus, or with the Thunderous, sorry. And Tornadus, if you're able to get that 3 energies on Tornadus really early on turn 3, the fact that you're hitting your opponent's bench is awesome, because it can really, really shut down your opponent. It's got great energy recycling in terms of Lantern and Fishman. It's always good to have Lantern just sitting on your bench from the early game, just drawing in those energies that get from your knocked out Pokemon. Generally, you don't need to put energies on Lantern. If it's been sitting there for a while, it's got itself charged up. Fisherman, you're putting energies back in your hand, always really good. This deck has bench type in the form of Thunderous, which is always good. 80 damage to the active Pokemon and 20 damage to everything else. Always good to see. MVPs, hands down, Dragonite, Tornadus, Thunderous, and Pidgeotto. Do not neglect Pidgeotto playing this deck. Being able to get 2 draws from a turn, and that second draw essentially being an option, is huge. Pidgeotto is a cornerstone from this deck. Don't just evolve it. Let it sit there as a supporter. So there are some bad things about this deck. It's reliant on its draw support. This deck tends to go through energy really quickly, especially if you're going with Dragonite as a more active slot. So you want to be constantly drawing. So be very, very careful to make sure that you get your energy cards, your draw cards out, and that you really focus on getting those draws going. It's going to go a long way to making the deck really good. Good matchups. Basically everything. This deck, if you get a good hand, plays well against everyone. And most decks struggle to deal with Soaring Storm because it's so reliable. You're able to get out your answers basically every game, and those answers hit like a ton of bricks, which is absolutely fantastic. However, there are some bad matchups. Now, Towering Heights can be a little bit difficult. I know Thunderous is resistant to it, but Tornadus is Tornadus is that was right around. Thunderous is resistant to it and Tornadus is weak against it. No, it's the other way around, sorry. And I always get mixed up between those two Pokemon. Now, the problem is Towering Heights does like having damage on its bench. So when you put damage on your opponent's bench, then you're kind of charging them up, which is very, very awkward. So Towering Heights does well against this deck. Stormcaller, it hits your bench, which you don't want. And the fact that you're hitting your own bench, Stormcaller can capitalize off that, which is a really big problem. Unseen Depths, same thing. You're hitting your own bench, Unseen Depths can capitalize off that. So be very careful of that. Other than that, as I've said in my previous video, and my previous videos of our top 10s, there's not much more to say about Soaring Storm. Other than it's a super reliable deck, it's super fun to play. So, that is my top 10 for June. I hope you did enjoy them, and please do let me know. I love reading the comments on these videos and hearing everyone's opinion. And those opinions really do go together towards building my next top 10. So please feel free to let me know. If you disagree with me, awesome. Let me know why. Don't just say you hate my top 10. Let me know why. I want to know why you think a certain deck is better than a certain deck. And if you agree with it, awesome. Let me know what you agree with, because I'm certainly still learning, and certainly it's always a fine fix for these decks. And yeah, so thanks so much for watching this. If you're watching this before the end of June, don't forget I do have a giveaway. I'll link the video up ahead, where I'm giving away 6 Sword and Shield booster packs by just simply commenting on one of my videos, because it is a thank you for the awesome 500 subs. So thank you so much to everyone who subbed to my channel. I really do appreciate it, and I'm going to bring out a lot more content like this. Also, if you stayed around for this long, I would also really appreciate your comments as to whether you prefer this format for the top 10s. I've swapped it around this month. I think I prefer this format. It's a bit more informative, and I think it's a better way of presenting it. But hey, let me know what you think. So, as always, everybody, thanks so much. Cheers, and enjoy.